Like most franchises that sort of take over the world to the point of being a mainstay in pop culture, Call of Duty started with a relatively modest beginning. The series since 2003 has developed 20 mainline games, 3 tie-in games made on inferior hardware, 4 handheld titles, 3 online battle royale games, 6 mobile games, comics, and whatever else. Point is, this once relatively humble franchise is no longer humble, and what started as your basic PC shooter from Activision would go on to sell the 4th most amount of copies of any game series in history, with an estimated 425 million copies, falling short of Pokemon, Tetris, and Mario being the top 3 selling franchises. Unlike those other series, though, gameplay changes between entries have been relatively small, and there aren't a lot of spin-offs. The aforementioned 3 have different games in the series that are wholly different from the original concept or remixed enough to feel different from the last. Call of Duty primarily just changes the setting, weapon, and tweaks mechanics between entries, and the many studios that work on the series. What I mean is, at least the primary functions of the game haven't needed to change much in 20 years, primarily due to the addicting gameplay loop of the online mode, which is Call of Duty's bread and butter. A Call of Duty match takes a handful of minutes to complete, varying slightly based on game mode, and with modern technology, you can load into a new lobby in seconds and play against a new set of the millions of active users from around the world. By the time the 12-month cycle is over, people are looking for the new tweaked mechanics, new maps, new modes, and just a general new entry to kind of freshen up the gameplay. Despite the fan base of Call of Duty seemingly always saying I'm not buying the next entry, it looks like shit, they seem to always do it. I've always been a pretty passive Call of Duty player. Like, I'll buy the entry that's like 5 years old for a few bucks and plug it in to give it a spin, get addicted for a few weeks, then put it down. However, in a move that could only be considered selling out to some gamers, I wanted to examine the genesis of the shooter series and hopefully get some subscribers in the process. However, admitting that I'm a Call of Duty normie may not have helped my case on that fact. For this video, I didn't actually play the original PC port, rather I dusted off one of my 3 Xbox 360s and slowly loaded through each menu to buy the Xbox 360 port of this game, which was retitled to Call of Duty Classic. This is a convenient rename because if it was simply called Call of Duty, I would never find this shit. Even by the end of the Xbox 360 eras, there was like 11 Call of Duty games and all sorts of DLC on the console. I looked it up on Steam, where it's still just titled Call of Duty, and not Call of Duty Classic, and it was on the 4th page of the search. It's a tricky guy to find if you're looking to track this down to play it yourself like I did. Currently, the game is not available on any home gaming console outside of the 7th generation of consoles, which is kinda shitty. I chose Xbox 360 as well, because it was easier for me to access than my PS3, which was in storage at the time that I was writing this, and I had my Xbox 360 ready to go at a moment's notice. For the best performance, I would imagine you probably want to buy this on Steam, but for some reason I felt nostalgic and wanted to play it on my Xbox 360, and with Xbox backwards compatibility being the most solid part of owning that platform, I rarely find myself venturing back from my modern Xbox Series S console. So this was my excuse. Xbox had this under the Xbox 360 arcade banner, which would basically just meant it was relatively cheap. Lots of Xbox arcade titles were old games ported to the Xbox, shitty movie games, or smaller games developed by larger studios. Clearly, Activision doesn't have much love for this game because over 20 years after its release, it is the sole mainline Call of Duty game that will not work on your Xbox Series X. This could be in part due to the fact that the game was distributed by Aspyr for the classic version rather than Activision like the regular port, but I kinda doubt it. If Aspyr can still sell it, why not dump the game and get some pay here and there for the digital file on the newer system? And if Activision has the rights, why not just dump the ROM? Anyways, I really rambled through this intro. Let's check out the genesis of Call of Duty, and let's see if it's good or a big piece of shit that was abandoned by Activision. Okay, so the story of this game is a little odd. Basically, while directing Saving Private Ryan, Steven Spielberg thought, what if I did this but in video game form? So he started working with his video game studio at the time, DreamWorks Interactive, which he was a major player in founding. You know, the company that made Shrek and all that. They also made Saving Private Ryan, and eventually they took a pitch to EA, who would pick up the game, and DreamWorks Interactive made the first Medal of Honor game. 2 games, one in 1999 and one in 2000, before the game series was passed to 2015 Inc., who did the 3rd game in the series, Medal of Honor Allied Assault. The team who made Medal of Honor Allied Assault ended up jumping ship and forming a new company called Infinity Ward and creating their own concept called Call of Duty, which was set to compete against the EA franchise. Activision had a hand in it as well, as the initial Infinity Ward team started the company while finishing up at EA, and Activision quickly bought 30% stake in their company and eventually absorbed it into a subsidiary. Ironically, the game was codenamed Medal of Honor Killer, which brings to mind the now often used phrase in FPS gaming, the COD Killer. Anyhow, unlike Call of Duty, which is yet to find a successor in the niche, Call of Duty would prove to kill Medal of Honor's brand viability, with EA not having nearly the weight Activision does in the FPS genre today. Ironically, some of the Infinity Ward team would jump ship years later to make Titanfall and eventually Apex Legends, which was their attempt to make a Call of Duty killer at EA. It's an endless cycle, apparently. Regardless, the game would eventually come out in 2003. There would be a PC exclusive expansion called Call of Duty United Offensive, which would expand the game by one mission, an on-rail plane shooter, that wouldn't be available in the original game, and is not available on Steam or on the Call of Duty Classics port. Being that that's the case, I was not able to track that version down without buying the CD and then managing to get it working on my modern PC, so I said fuck it and decided to not play that version. It also expands the multiplayer modes, which is relatively dead at this point, and I can't imagine there's actually servers up for it still. So it seems like a pretty pointless addition to my collection if I went out to actually try to play that. So I guess, while it's technically the definitive edition of Call of Duty Classic, I would take a gander and guess it's not really worth picking up. Call of Duty takes place over 3 separate campaigns that take you through a series of missions revolving around World War II. In the American campaign, you play as a member of the 506th Infantry Regiment. Much like in real life, the company was essentially scattered amongst Normandy when they parachuted in, having members joining mixed units in the battle. The campaign takes you through 7 units and has some cool variety, a driving level, a few dramatic shootouts, and a prison break. You'll start to learn after this first campaign that things are a little unbalanced in level design. Some of these missions are like 10 minutes long, and some of them stretch much longer. The American campaign feels occasionally tough, but pretty fair for the most part, and the final prison break was definitely a highlight of the campaign. The tough but fair compliment is not something I can continue to pull over when talking about the British campaign, which especially in this version of the game, where you don't get a pick when you save, is pretty brutal. The British campaign is absolute cancer. I think the most brutal part is the truck chase, where you need to shoot panzer rounds at pursuing trucks. You simply have to perfectly destroy like 12 trucks while managing your health bar, not missing a shot, and not being shot by other enemies. This is after an already brutal sniper section, where you have to shoot 10 guys with only enough time to reload once before you die instantly. After this, you go to an airfield which has a similar problem. You need to shoot dive bombers, while also constantly taking down other ground enemies because the AI partners are too stupid to actually protect you. I'm not sure if the AI is supposed to be more help, but in this mission specifically, don't rely on them too much, because if you do, you'll probably get fucked over. And they also just constantly yell random shit at you, like, start shooting, buddy. It's like, fuck you, dude. You start shooting, dog. I just took out like 10 fucking dive bombers. The highlight of this second campaign is definitely infiltrating the dam and fighting the enemies. Here it has a fun concept at least, and it's mostly fair, though again, saving is inconsistent. You just kind of have to hope it saves at ideal times. Also, these missions are mostly like 3 minutes long, bar the dam, which is a bit longer in the British campaign, but it's such a brutal 3 minutes because they just crank up the difficulty and do random shit, like your team doesn't protect you, or they just have ridiculous mechanics. For example, when the enemies are crossing the bridge in that truck section I was complaining about earlier, why the second they cross do I automatically lose? Like, why can't I just shoot them? There's like 3 guys. But if they hit the other side, you automatically lose, and this was exclusively to pad. And I'm not saying you shouldn't be good at the sniper rifle, but it's occasionally difficult when you have reload times because you can literally not miss any shot, or you basically have to wait 30 seconds for them to hobble across the bridge so that they can fucking kill you. It's bullshit. Like, I felt like Activision, or the section that made the British campaign at least, wanted to combat the short mission times with difficulty, which occasionally feels frustrating because if you actually go through the mission, there's about 3 minutes of gameplay and mostly you're just repeating a bunch of shit. Yeah, the dive bomber and truck chase missions felt like something definitely designed for a more accurate PC mouse as well. Trying to track these shots on an Xbox 360 controller seemed pretty tricky. Also, your fucking character moves so slow when you're trying to steer his head around. So, that sucks too. I know it was designed as a PC shooter, but it doesn't really feel like the game controls were optimized to fit the console, as it definitely should have for this port, which I don't think would have been too hard really. Just allow more sensitivity options, and perhaps adjust the aiming a bit. I don't really know. If and when I play the next game in the Call of Duty series, Call of Duty Finest Hours, the 6th generation console spin-off of the first game, I hope, since it's a console exclusive game, the controls are more optimized for the different controller type. Finally, you have the Russian campaign, and it's actually good somehow. I'm not sure if they had 3 teams design the campaigns, but where the American campaign was messy and short, but kind of fun, sort of tough but fair situation, the British campaign was gimmicky and cheap. The Russian campaign is actually really fair, has adequate health drops, frequent save points, and it also allows you to use a variety of weapons effectively. Where the sniper is totally useless in the British and American campaign, most of the Russian campaign you have the option to use the sniper, which can be good, to even the odds quite a bit, before you switch to a machine gun to start clearing the crowds. I still died a fair handful of times in this campaign, but unlike the British campaign, it didn't feel like brutal, unfair BS that was just kind of killing you to kill you, or giving you a challenge that's so ridiculously precise that it just kind of takes the fun out of the game unless you're just really fucking good at Call of Duty. I virtually never got frustrated because typically it felt fair when I died. I will say the levels are a little long and I got bored of the gameplay loop pretty quickly, so it took me quite a few sittings to beat the Russian campaign because it's like 8 or 9 missions long. I also appreciated the lack of small tunnel areas that the British campaign was full of, and not constantly being solo on missions. When you have to get to certain spots with no cover to get enemies to spawn with some bullshit in the British campaign, made it more of a twitch shooter with clunky and slow controls, making it so it kinda worked like shit. When it does get tight in the sewer section, it still isn't blatantly pulling tricks to fuck you over like the British campaign will. You end the campaign on a couple of tank missions too, which are short and kinda fun. The driving's actually pretty well designed. When you get used to it, it isn't so bad. I don't mind this gimmick level, which is surprising since pretty much every gimmick level in this game otherwise is total bullshit. Definitely designed much better than the British BS levels for sure. Overall, the Russian campaign is far and away the best one, and it's not even a contest. Like, the American campaign's okay, the British campaign is bullshit, and the Russian campaign's actually a pretty fun little ride, so you just gotta beat the first 2 to get there. After the 3 campaigns, you have the 3 conclusion levels, which wraps up the story for each campaign. One for the Americans, one for the British, and the Russians get one too. The conclusion levels for the Americans are far and away the easiest. It's a pretty fun little invasion mission where you have plenty of AI companions to help. The AI companions are kind of ass compared to the enemy AI for sure, but you can follow their line of sight to get an idea where the enemy may be. This mission and the British mission are both in super foggy areas, which I don't know if it was an aesthetic choice or if it was to hide the piss poor draw distance. So sometimes you're just shooting muzzle flashes from across the map, and don't worry, the enemies can see you just fine. That's one thing that kind of annoyed me in this game. Like, if you even remotely peek out, it doesn't matter if they're hailing bullets on your ally, you have about half a second before they immediately detect you, even if you're like 1,000 meters away in a building, hiding behind rocks, crouched on the ground, they'll start shooting you. Don't worry, these fucking AIs have perfect detection, and your AI, pretty much useless. Anyhow, on the other hand, the British level, again, is kind of ass. Putting you in a pretty large field, essentially, and you get to run through a massive, massive field where the enemies are virtually invisible except the muzzle flashes. Don't worry, they'll be able to hit you no matter where the fuck you are. The trick to this one is essentially take it very slow, but also learn when to rush it. Once you defeat enemies, they don't respawn back in. So you essentially have to defeat like 30 enemies or so, and then rush it. With the British campaign, your only ally is Frenchie, and Frenchie is fucking useless. But anyways, you and Frenchie are going to traverse around this battlefield, killing everybody. Eventually, you'll refuel the rockets and blow them up. But I gotta say, this was one of the most frustrating parts of the game. Another bullshit British mission, in my opinion. Finally, you have the Russian mission, which starts hard as nails as you blow up 4 artillery points. But once you raid the mansion, while a bit tough, it's fun. And really, after the artillery part, it's kind of a breeze. It's fucking annoying in the best way possible. Like, when you're doing the artillery part, I think it's very hard. But it almost has like a puzzle game aspect, because you just covered from all around. So once you kind of learn the route and what you have to do, and learn where the enemies are, at that point you just gotta play the game pretty well, get your aim up to chop, and you'll eventually get it. It's definitely frustrating at first as you try to kind of memorize the map, but with the draw distance working, it's not as frustrating as the British campaign, which kind of just makes you blind fire at muzzle flashes for most of the time and kind of hope that all the enemies are dead. You have a pretty clear idea of the geography after 1 or 2 plays and where enemies are. And you can actually see them because the draw distance works fine in this level. So just take them all out and then head to the mansion. And then finally, you get the achievement that says, yay, you beat Call of Duty. I kind of wish you could pick the order you play the campaigns in, or just expand the Russian campaign, because frankly, in my opinion, the American campaign is pretty fucking boring for the most part, but it's okay. The British campaign is terrible, and the Russian campaign is exactly what I'd expect from a Call of Duty game made in 2003. The campaign feels way more in vein of a lot of the shooters I played at the time. I respect the British campaign for trying early attempts at the famous COD set pieces. It just didn't quite figure it out the way they would later on. And they also didn't understand that the set pieces are a lot less fun when you're forced to die 4,000 times and you have to do everything perfectly. It doesn't really allow for much of a gameplay loop besides just memorizing exactly what you're supposed to do, to the turn, to the shot. There isn't much of you actually trying to figure out what to do. You just kind of memorize how the set piece is supposed to go. And you do that over and over again until you memorize each piece, and it very rarely saves, so it's not like you just memorize something and restart a couple, like 30 seconds back. You get to the last part of the level, miss a shot, and essentially have to restart half the level. I understand in the actual PC game, people just kind of save scum the whole time. That's not an option on the Xbox 360. You're more so praying that the game actually decides to save at all. And another thing I want to point out at one point, and it really frustrated me, is I ended up beating a level, and then I quit out because I was done for the day. I loaded into the next level first, mind you, and once I loaded back in the next day, I was put back in the previous level with like a third of the level left to rebeat. I got through it fine because I already knew kind of what that level had to expect, but it was kind of annoying. It's like, okay, I literally loaded into another level, beat part of the level, decided I was going to take a break, and then I'm spawned back in a previous save file. It's crazy. It doesn't make sense a lot of the times. Going back to kind of the British set pieces, I think if you look at something like the Halo series, it's constant fun gimmicks and set pieces in those early Halo games. And the early Call of Duty games kind of ran around the same era as those Halo games. They both feel fun. You can occasionally die. I'm not saying it has to be a total power fantasy. But, make it something that's more impressive and fun to play. That kind of brings up the adrenaline and changes up the gameplay loop for a couple minutes. I don't need to die constantly because I missed one shot. these aren't memory games, in my opinion. I think an FPS should have more options to kind of complete it. And when it becomes just a blatant memory game with kind of jagged controls, it's not the most fun. The gameplay in the original Call of Duty will be pretty familiar to Call of Duty fans, but it's quite a bit more crude. Like modern games, you can look down the sights for better accuracy or shoot from the hip. And on the Xbox 360, the controls will feel very familiar to modern Call of Duty. There are a few features that have been phased out since this game came out. For example, the lean you can use, which is honestly fairly useful for peeking around corners in this game, especially with how receptive the AI are and how quickly you have to start shooting before they detect you, even when you're fairly well hidden and take them on by surprise. You can also tap L3 to switch from automatic to semi-automatic on machine guns, which I thought was a tiny bit odd since typically you already have a rifle on you, so you probably don't want to nerf your machine gun and make it semi-automatic. This game also doesn't have a sprint button, and with that button being tied to switching out of automatic, I admittedly switched out of automatic a few times when I instinctively tried to sprint. One thing that's occasionally annoying is that you have to toggle through your weapons to get grenades. It's not a separate button like the later game and makes it a bit of a pain when you're tied down and need to quickly get a grenade out. But honestly, as I was playing the game, I kind of got used to it, so it's kind of a non-issue. But later on, they add that quality of life that you can kind of just click RB and let one fly. The controls are a mix of familiar and not familiar, but once you get used to it, they aren't too bad. And definitely not so far off that modern gamers wouldn't pick them up pretty fast, like some FPSs. I'm thinking like GoldenEye or Perfect Dark, which are a little further from our modern sensibilities than something like this. On that note, some of this game is a bit guess and check, as I've kind of mentioned. Certain enemies won't leave a room, for example, till you're halfway down a hall with no cover. So you have to inch out and quickly retreat. It feels a bit unfair. Also, this annoyance is compounded by the fact that saving is blatantly inconsistent, as I've said multiple times. There are scripted save points. Sometimes you'll play for 15 minutes and then die and be sent all the way back, and on your second attempt it'll randomly save before you died originally. Like, I'm fairly casual to the Call of Duty games, as we kind of established, so I'm not going to be able to play a no-death run of this game. And being randomly sent back 15 minutes of progress and just having to memorize exactly where each enemy is just to die and be sent back to do it again, and then next time it saves halfway through the progress I made, it's so inconsistent and annoying, but whatever. Occasionally your squad can just fight enemies for you while you do little to nothing. It's not fun doing that, but you can have them fight enemies for you while you do nothing. There's also another mission where you're playing as the British holding down a bridge and you have to survive 5 minutes fighting tank after tank. And if you miss them with the rocket, they'll immediately shoot your bunker, and even with the bunker, you pretty much die instantly, or you get critically wounded and get this weird gimmick where your camera's all shaky and it makes it impossible for you to actually aim at a tank that's 5,000 feet away until they shoot you again and blow you to pieces. So finally I said fuck it, and I just laid down at the bottom of the stairs of the bunker so I couldn't be hit, and I camped by the door for probably 3 minutes and literally didn't fight a single soldier in this time. This is just kind of poor game design. I mean, if you missed the tank, they kill you automatically. And if you kill one, you have about 20 seconds before another one shows up. Keep in mind, another tank won't spawn unless you kill the last tank. So the best way to efficiently complete the challenge is just to camp where the tanks can't hit you and wait for the time to elapse. Okay, another thing I wanted to discuss were health packs. Unlike modern COD, where your health will just eventually restore if you're in cover long enough, the health pack system works, but it's occasionally too brutal and occasionally too generous. I found in the American campaign, the health packs were pretty fair. In the British campaign, they'd give you like one of the weaker health packs per level. And the Russian campaign were occasionally too plentiful with them. For example, when you storm the apartment building, there was another countdown mission. I think this one was 3 minutes. And I kind of just camped again. I didn't want to run around and shoot because I felt like that'd be a good way to get killed. So I was camping, and like every enemy I shot was dropping health packs. So I was at full health, probably got hit like 20 times. I thought that was a little busted. So they just really didn't know how to do health pack drops very well, and that's also occasionally frustrating. I didn't mind the health pack system. In fact, it probably makes it a little easier than being able to just retreat, come back to full health, and then try again, except with half the enemies. Getting killed surely because you haven't been able to restore your health in a while seems kind of ridiculous, and adds to that kind of guess and check feel of the gameplay. I'll say you also probably want to switch your weapons with your enemy's weapons when you can. This is, of course, exempt for the Russian campaign, which gives you plenty of ammo, and your guns are just busted in the Russian campaign. But in the British and American campaigns, you can pretty much just switch out the shitty machine gun it gives you for the machine gun that the Nazi soldiers drop. For one, anytime you kill a soldier, they drop like 40 ammo. So you pretty much have unlimited ammo if you do that. And with your standard gun, you have no chance of getting any more ammo throughout the level. Like, there's no American drop packs or anything, which makes sense, I suppose. I typically recommend you just steal a Nazi gun right away and get at it. Overall, the gameplay is fine, but some of the features, in hindsight, seem obsolete and pointless. The series certainly went on to improve the controls, and I think the save system is completely inconsistent and ridiculous. The game often feels like a memorization game with a lot of guess and check. I'm thinking specifically of missions like the vehicle mission, which I described, where you have to blow up the trucks that chase you, the dive bomber mission, and a lot of the tight corridor British missions where you walk forward and halfway down the hall, two Nazis jump out, you have no cover, and they immediately start spraying you with machine gun bullets. So you just kind of got to know. You got to run down the hall and plant a grenade right away, scaring them back into the room or something. But it's something that as a first-time player walking down the hall, you don't really come to expect right away. So that gets occasionally frustrating, especially when you're pretty far in and with the shitty save feature get sent back 15 minutes because of it. And also with the slow sticks, having enemies just kind of pop up 3 or 4 at a time out of a random door that you can't get to without cover feels a little unfair. It seems like you just kind of got to pray and spray, which is a term I was using often playing this game. I don't think it's feasible to beat certain parts on your first go unless you're really, really good at Call of Duty, which is fine occasionally making something hard, but at points it just feels like bullshit in this game. The graphics are actually pretty solid for a 2003 game ported to consoles in 2009. The textures are nothing special, and it's definitely dated, but as someone who was gaming back in 2003, I can certainly respect how great it looks graphically for back at that time. Especially at the time, it was hard to do anything too crazy impressive with a more lifelike style, so a lot of the graphical displays that hold up the best are experiences with unique art styles. So for a war simulator, I think the graphics are good, and besides the occasional draw distance issue, it's not too difficult to detect enemies from far off. I also didn't notice too much pop-in on the console port either, so pretty impressive. Man, Call of Duty's a mixed bag. I found myself having a lot of fun at points, but the age of the game really shows at others. For one, the inconsistent save system is wildly annoying. This is the 9th time I bring it up, and it makes for a super inconsistent gaming experience, and is 100% my biggest complaint about this port of the game. I don't mind getting punished or failing per se, but there has to be a standard. If your save points don't work, I occasionally feel like I would die and be sent like 15 minutes back, and it was just like, meh, I'm going to take a break and come back. It didn't really make for a fun experience. The lack of the big Call of Duty set pieces the franchise is known for is evident, but not a huge deal as they come later, and the attempts at set pieces are pretty bad as I've stated. And there's a lot of useless features that get cut later that won't really be missed. I can kind of understand why Activision shows a lack of reverence for this game, since frankly it's a real mixed bag, and it's essentially a very, very loose prototype of what would become one of the largest gaming franchises of all time. I think the best technique for something like this would be to clean up the save system further and port it to Game Pass or something like that, as a curiosity for fans to play. Now that Microsoft is absorbing Activision, I see that as possible eventually, especially given their reverence for past content. My understanding is that the PC version has a manual save system, so I think if you're bad like me, it'd probably be the best way to play it. For more novice players, you can make your own checkpoints, and for advanced players, you can opt out of checkpoints if you really want. Anyways, playing this kind of just feels like a slapdash port they kind of just threw out. I wish it was less awkward to play, but this is definitely a PC shooter. It just doesn't quite feel right on consoles, even with the controls translated to the best of Aspire's ability, and to their credit, it seems like a pretty solid port job for the most part, by the terrible save system. I think starting at Call of Duty Modern Warfare, the series definitely just became an experience optimized for consoles, where this is very much a game optimized for PCs, and that's probably the reason this is the only port you can play on consoles. So was this actually the Medal of Honor killer Infinity Ward set out to make? Kind of, but not really. Medal of Honor would continue to go strong through 2007 when Call of Duty eventually took over enough of its market share to where EA rebooted Medal of Honor to be more like Call of Duty Modern Warfare, and by that point, it felt more like a cheap copy of Call of Duty rather than the great FPS shooter that led the genre for a few years in the late 90s and early 2000s. After 2 games in that series, EA would abandon the series until ironically Respawn would reboot it for a VR experience. Of course, that kind of makes the whole story come full circle. So was it a Call of Duty killer? Not really. I think if we look at the pretty clear evidence and pattern, I think Modern Warfare shook EA to the point where they took a couple years off to regain footing on the franchise, but by that point Call of Duty had already advanced way beyond what EA was capable of at the time, making their game series obsolete. Next up is a video on Star Wars The Clone Wars, the movie.